The wind at Thermopylae never truly rested. It slid down from the Malian Gulf carrying salt, damp earth, and the faint smell of rot from old marshes. On that narrow strip of land between mountain and sea, it whispered like a warning no man could silence. Spartan cloaks snapped softly in the breeze as the soldiers stood in loose ranks, bronze armor dull under a pale sky that promised nothing good. Leonidas walked among them without escort. He did not need one. His presence alone straightened backs and stilled restless hands. He paused beside a young hoplite whose fingers kept tightening and loosening around his spear shaft. "You grip it like it will run away," Leonidas said quietly. The young man swallowed. "Yes, my king." Leonidas placed a hand over the man's grip, firm but calm. "It will not leave you today, and you will not leave it." The soldier nodded, breathing slower now. Leonidas moved on. Far ahead, beyond the curve of the road, the Persians were coming, not yet visible, but felt. The sound arrived first, a low, distant murmur like surf striking stone, except it did not fade. It grew, thousands of feet, thousands of voices. Somewhere in that mass were drums, beating time for an empire that believed the world already belonged to it. Behind the Spartans, waves slapped gently against rocks. Gulls cried overhead, circling as if they already sensed a feast to come. The pass itself was narrow enough that 2 carts could barely pass side by side. Leonidas had chosen this place carefully. Here, numbers would suffocate themselves. A veteran named Alkippos knelt, tightening the leather straps on his greaves. His beard was streaked with gray, his face carved by years of war. He glanced up at his friend Dorios, who was rubbing oil into the rim of his shield. "Strange place to die," Alkippos muttered. Dorios snorted softly. "Better than a bed, better than old age." Still, Alkippos said, lowering his voice, "They say Xerxes drinks wine from gold and sleeps on silk." Dorios looked toward the pass. "Let him. He will remember this place longer than any palace." A horn sounded from the Persian side, long, confident, mocking. It echoed off the cliffs, multiplying until it seemed the mountains themselves were calling Sparta to its end. The allied Greeks stood behind the Spartans. Thespians, Thebans, men from smaller cities would come with fear in their eyes and hope clenched tightly in their chests. They watched the Spartans closely, searching for signs of doubt. They found none. Leonidas climbed onto a low rock, his red cloak falling around him like spilled blood. His voice carried easily. "Men of Sparta," he said, then paused, letting the sound of the wind fill the silence. "And men of Greece." Heads lifted. Even the waves seemed to quiet. "We stand where the land itself has chosen us, not because we are many, not because we are strong, but because here we can decide the shape of today." A Persian scout appeared briefly at the far end of the pass, riding close enough to see faces. He turned and galloped back without a word. Leonidas continued, "Some of you will die. That is truth. Any man who says otherwise lies. But know this, if we fall, it will not be forgotten. The earth will remember. The sea will remember. And the men who march against us will remember every step they take through this place." A murmur rippled through the ranks, not fear, but acceptance. The Spartans began their preparations with ritual precision. Helmets were adjusted, shields lifted and tested. Spears were planted in the dirt, then pulled free again, checking balance. One man began to sing softly, an old Spartan marching song, low and steady. Others joined, not loudly, but together, voices blending into a single, calm rhythm. From the Persian side, movement finally appeared. Lines upon lines of soldiers emerged, their armor flashing, their banners snapping in the wind. They filled the road, spilled outward where they could, a living wall of flesh and steel. Cavalry rode along the edges, horses stamping impatiently. The drums grew louder, faster. A messenger approached under a white cloth, escorted by Persian guards. He stopped well within spear range, clearly expecting deference. "I speak for King Xerxes," he announced, "lord of all lands. Lay down your weapons, and you may return to your homes alive." A few of the Greek allies shifted uneasily. The Persian army behind the messenger seemed endless. Leonidas stepped forward alone. "Tell your king," he said evenly, "that Sparta has answered." The messenger frowned. "Answered what?" Leonidas' eyes did not leave him. "Come and take them." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then laughter broke out among the Persians, sharp, disbelieving. The messenger turned and hurried back, his white cloth flapping like a surrender already rejected. The Persian drums changed tempo. Leonidas turned to his men. Shields. 300 bronze faces snapped into place. Shields locked. The line became a wall. Spears. Points angled forward, steady as a forest frozen in time. The ground began to shake as the first Persian units advanced at a jog, confident, loud, shouting promises of death in languages the Greeks did not understand. Dorio's leaned close to Alkippos. "Hear that?" Alkippos nodded. "They think noise is courage." The Persians broke into a run. Leonidas raised his arm. "Hold." Feet thundered closer. Faces became visible, young, old, eager, afraid. "Hold." The distance closed to nothing. "Now." The Spartan line surged forward as one. Spears struck home. The sound was not heroic. It was wet, brutal, final. The first Persian rank collapsed instantly, bodies crashing into those behind them. The Spartans pushed, shields driving, spears withdrawing and striking again with practiced economy. Screams filled the pass. Blood sprayed onto bronze. The wind carried metallic stench into every breath. Leonidas fought at the front, his movements efficient, almost calm. He did not shout. He did not rage. He killed, stepped, killed again. Behind him, the wall held. And far back on his throne, King Xerxes leaned forward, his confidence faltering for the first time, as he realized this narrow road was about to devour his army. The first clash did not end the way the Persians expected. It never did. What they believed would be a crushing wave became instead a grinding stone, and they were the grain caught beneath it. Bodies piled at the front of the pass, forcing the next ranks to climb over their own dead. The Spartans did not give ground. They advanced a step, then another, shields locked, spears thrusting with cold precision. The Persian officers shouted frantically, waving swords, trying to force momentum into a space that would not allow it. The narrowness of Thermopylae betrayed them. 10 men could not fight at once. Only 2, sometimes 3, could reach the Spartan line, and each who did was met by bronze and discipline. Alkippos felt the shock of impact travel up his arm as his spear struck a man square in the chest. The Persian gasped, eyes wide, before collapsing backward, dragging another down with him. Alkippos withdrew his spear and stepped forward, planting his shield against the next attacker. "Left," Dorio's called. Alkippos shifted instinctively. A blade scraped across his shield rim, sparks flashing briefly before vanishing into daylight. He answered with a short thrust that found a throat. They had trained for this since boyhood. No wasted movement, no rage, just rhythm. Strike, withdraw, step. The men beside them breathed in time, their shields overlapping so tightly that arrows skittered off with harmless clinks. Behind the front line, Spartan officers rotated men out in calm, practiced motions. A tired soldier slipped back. A fresh one stepped forward. The wall never thinned, never broke. The Persians began to shout louder, trying to drown out the fear creeping into their ranks. Some turned their faces away at the last moment, instinctively flinching from the spears. Those men died quickest. Xerxes rose from his throne, disbelief hardening into anger. He had been told these Greeks were brave, but bravery was supposed to bend under weight. This did not bend. It bit. "Send more," he ordered. They came, wave after wave. Light infantry first, then better armed men. Each assault ended the same way, crushed against the Spartan wall. The sea breeze shifted, carrying the smell of blood back toward the Persian lines. Horses reared, unsettled. Drums struggled to keep rhythm as men faltered. A young Thespian behind the Spartan line stared wide-eyed at the carnage. "They keep coming," he whispered to no one. A Spartan officer heard him. "So do we," he replied. By midday, the ground was slick. Fallen bodies created uneven footing, forcing the Spartans to adjust their stance. Leonidas barked short commands, moving like a shadow along the line, correcting positions, pulling wounded men back before they collapsed. A Persian arrow struck his shield and lodged there, trembling. Leonidas snapped it off without looking and stepped forward, driving his spear into the man who had loosed it. Across the field, Persian commanders conferred desperately. Their lighter troops were being slaughtered. Reluctantly, a decision was made. The immortals advanced, 10,000 strong, elite soldiers of the Empire, their armor darker, their weapons finer. Gold glinted on spearheads and scale mail. They moved without shouting, faces hidden beneath cloth and bronze, confidence restored by reputation alone. When they reached the killing ground, the Spartans felt the difference immediately. These men did not rush. They probed. They struck in groups, trying to pry open gaps, aiming at legs and shield rims. "Steady," Leonidas called. The clash intensified. Immortal spears slid past shields. One Spartan went down with a cry as a blade found his thigh. He was dragged back instantly, another man stepping into his place before the Persians could exploit the opening. Alkippos took a cut across his forearm, blood darkening his grip. He ignored it, tightening his hold and smashing his shield into the mortal's face, following with a downward stab that crushed collarbone and lung. Dorio's lost a spear when it snapped against armor. He drew his sword without hesitation and pressed forward, blade rising and falling in short, brutal arcs. The immortals fought well. They died all the same. Their longer spears were useless in the press. Their lighter shields buckled under Spartan weight. Each time they tried to encircle, the terrain betrayed them, funneling them back into the narrow throat of the pass. Xerxes watched as his finest warriors fell, his fists clenched so tightly his nails cut skin. He rose again, then sat, then rose once more, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "They are only men," he hissed. At dusk, the Persians finally pulled back. The pass fell eerily quiet, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the slap of waves against stone. The Spartans did not cheer. They did not chase. They stood where they were, breathing hard, chests heaving beneath bronze. Leonidas walked among the fallen. He knelt beside a young Spartan whose breath rattled wetly in his chest. "Did we hold?" the boy asked. Leonidas nodded. "Yes." The boy smiled once and went still. Night came slowly. Fires burned on the Persian side, thousands of them stretching beyond sight. On the Greek side, there were only a few small flames, carefully shielded from the wind. Men ate quietly, chewing dried meat with blood-stained hands. Some cleaned weapons. Others stared into the dark. Alkippos flexed his injured arm. "They will come again tomorrow." Dorio's nodded. "Yes." No fear colored his voice, only certainty. Leonidas stood at the edge of the pass, looking out at the enemy fires. He knew this was only the beginning. Persia would adapt. It always did. But for this day, the line had held. And somewhere deep within the Persian camp, the first seeds of doubt had been planted, growing silently in the dark. Morning crept into Thermopylae on a thin, gray light, as if the sun itself hesitated to look upon what the night had hidden. Mist rolled in from the sea, clinging low to the ground, veiling bodies where they lay tangled in armor and cloth. The smell had changed. Blood, iron, sweat, and something sour that settled in the throat and refused to leave. The Spartans woke without horns or orders. Habit guided them. Men rose, stretched stiff limbs, checked wounds that had hardened overnight into dark, crusted streaks. Some bindings were tightened. Others were replaced. Those who could not stand were moved gently to the rear, where allied Greeks tended them in silence. Leonidas walked the line as he always did, his steps slow, measured. He paused beside Alkippos, whose forearm was wrapped in linen already darkening. "It will hold," Alkippos said before being asked. Leonidas nodded. "If it doesn't, you will still stand." Alkippos allowed himself a brief smile. Beyond the mist, the Persians were stirring. Drums began again, slower this time, cautious. Horns answered from different points, echoing off the cliffs in uneven patterns. The sound no longer carried confidence. It carried calculation. As the fog thinned, shapes emerged. Lines forming, shields rising, archers stepping forward in disciplined rows. The Persians had learned something from yesterday. They would not rush blindly again. Leonidas raised his arm. Shields. The wall locked together with familiar sound, bronze kissing bronze. Spears. Points angled forward, steady despite fatigue. The Persian archers loosed first. Arrows rose into the pale sky in dark arcs, hissing as they fell. Most struck shields, clattered off helmets, or buried themselves uselessly in the dirt. A few found gaps. A Spartan to Leonidas left staggered as an arrow pierced beneath his arm. He was pulled back instantly, blood streaming down his side. "Hold!" Leonidas called. The arrows kept coming, wave after wave, but the shield wall endured. When the volleys finally stopped, the Persians advanced again, heavier troops this time, armored, moving in tighter formations. They collided with the Spartan line, like water against stone. The fighting was slower now, heavier. Muscles burned, arms trembled, sweat blurred vision beneath helmet rims. Each thrust required more effort than the last. Each step forward contested fiercely. Dorio's felt his breath rasp inside his chest. He switched grip on his sword, feeling the slickness of blood on the hilt. A Persian lunged low, aiming for his knee. Dorio's twisted his shield down just in time, the impact jarring his arm to the shoulder. He answered with a short, brutal cut that opened the man's face. Around him, the Spartans adapted. They shortened their strikes, conserving energy. They leaned more heavily on their shields, letting the enemy tire himself against them. Officers rotated men more frequently now, sensing the strain. Leonidas fought as if untouched by time. His movements remained precise, economical. When his spear broke, he took another without comment. When that one dulled, he cast it aside and drew his sword. On the Persian side, frustration grew. Their commanders shouted themselves hoarse. Men stumbled over the dead, slipped on blood, collided with one another in the narrow pass. Behind them, more troops pressed forward, forcing the front ranks into the Spartan blades whether they wished it or not. By midday, the mist had burned away, revealing the full horror of the field. The pass was clogged with bodies, armor crushed, faces frozen in shock. The sea lapped at the edges, indifferent. A sudden roar rose from the Persian ranks as cavalry attempted to push forward along the shoreline, hoping to break the Spartan flank. Horses screamed as they were driven toward the narrow strip of land, hooves slipping on wet stone. Spears low, Leonidas shouted. The Spartans adjusted instantly. The first horse impaled itself, momentum carrying it forward as rider and mount crashed together. Others reared, panicked, refusing to advance into the wall of bronze. The attempt collapsed into chaos. Xerxes stood again, his face tight with rage. He had believed fear alone would shatter these men. Now fear was spreading through his own ranks. By late afternoon, the attack slowed. Persian units withdrew in ragged order, dragging wounded with them, leaving the dead where they fell. The drums fell silent. The Spartans did not pursue. They stood, breathing hard, listening to the cries fade. As evening approached, Leonidas gathered his captains. "They test us," one said. "They probe." "They search for weakness," another added. Leonidas nodded. "They will find another way." He looked toward the mountains rising sharply behind the pass, their slopes rugged and shadowed, paths unseen, trails known only to locals and shepherds. Night fell again. Fires burned across the Persian camp, brighter than before, as if to compensate for something lost. The Greeks ate in silence, fatigue settling deep into bone. Dorio sat beside Alkippos, sharing a skin of water. "Do you think they will break?" Dorio's asked quietly. Alkippos stared into the dark. "No, empires do not break easily." "Neither do Spartans," Dorio said. Alkippos nodded. "That is the problem." Leonidas stood apart, gazing at the stars emerging above the cliffs. He thought of Sparta, of laws, of choices made long before this night. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the fires, a man would soon make a decision driven by fear and greed, one that would change the shape of this war. But for now, the line still held, and Thermopylae remained closed. The third dawn broke with a strange stillness, as if the land itself had drawn breath and refused to release it. No drums sounded from the Persian camp. No horns. Only the slow wash of the sea and the distant cry of birds circling high above the pass. The silence was unsettling, heavier than noise. The Spartans felt it immediately. Men tightened armor straps that did not need tightening. Shields were lifted, lowered, then lifted again. Veterans exchanged brief looks, wordless and knowing. Silence before battle was never a gift. It was a warning. Leonidas moved along the line, his expression unreadable. He paused near Dorio's and Alkippos. "They are thinking," Alkippos said under his breath. Leonidas answered quietly, "Yes." As the sun climbed, movement finally stirred in the Persian ranks. But it was not an advance. Units shifted laterally. Officers rode back and forth. Messengers ran, pointing toward the mountains, then toward the sea, then back again. Something was changing. A Greek scout emerged in the rear to run, breath ragged. "My king," he said, dropping to one knee. "The Persians are searching the slopes. Not here, behind us. Higher ground." Leonidas closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, his voice was calm. "Thank you." He dismissed the scout and turned toward the mountains, studying their sharp ridges and hidden folds. Goat paths twisted there, invisible from the road. Few men knew them well. Fewer still would dare guide an enemy through them. The silence broke suddenly as Persian archers stepped forward once more. This time, they did not fire immediately. They advanced closer than before, shields raised, testing distance. Leonidas raised his hand. "Hold." The first arrows flew low and fast, skipping off shields and striking legs. One found a Thespian's thigh. He went down with a cry, dragged back by his companions. Another arrow struck Alkippos' shield and shattered. Then the infantry advanced, not in reckless waves, but in compact groups, rotating in fresh men with disturbing efficiency. They had learned. The fighting resumed, harsher and more intimate than before. Swords rang. Shields slammed together. Men shouted in pain, in rage, in desperate effort to be heard over the chaos. Dorio's found himself locked shield to shield with a Persian officer, their faces inches apart. The man snarled something unintelligible and tried to twist his blade under the shield rim. Dorio's drove his forehead forward, cracking into the man's nose, then followed a thrust that ended the struggle. The ground was treacherous now. Blood pooled in shallow depressions. Corpses shifted underfoot. Every step demanded attention. Leonidas fought near the center, where pressure was greatest. A spear glanced off his helmet, ringing his ears. He countered instantly, driving his sword upward into the attacker's jaw. The Spartans advanced a single step, then another, reclaiming ground inch by inch. Each movement was paid for in blood. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the Persian attack slowed. Horns sounded, not the charge, but the recall. The Persians pulled back again, more orderly this time. Shields raised offensively as they retreated beyond spear range. The Spartans stood, chests heaving, watching them go. "That's it," Dorio said, disbelief creeping into his voice. "No," Alkippos replied. "That was never it." Leonidas turned to his captains. "They're done attacking here." A murmur rippled through the Greek ranks. Confusion. Unease. "What do you mean?" one of the allied commanders asked. Leonidas gestured toward the mountain behind them. "They are looking for another door." As if summoned by his words, another scout arrived, pale-faced, eyes wide with fear. "There is a man," he said, struggling for breath. "A local. He has gone to the Persians. He knows a path. A hidden one." The words fell like stones. For a long moment, no one spoke. Leonidas nodded slowly. "Ephialtes," he said. "I wonder how long it would take." The name spread quickly, bitterness thick on every tongue. "So it ends this way?" a Thespian officer asked. "Surrounded?" Leonidas looked at the men around him. Spartans hardened by years of discipline, allies who had stood shoulder to shoulder against impossible odds. "No," he said, "it does not end yet." The day wore on with no further attacks. Persian fires burned farther back now. some extinguished, others newly lit along the slopes. Movement flickered in places that should have remained dark. By evening, confirmation came. Persian troops were climbing the mountain path. The rear guard sent to block them had fallen. The trap was closing. Leonidas gathered the commanders as darkness settled over Thermopylae. "The Persians will reach the rear by dawn," he said plainly. "We cannot hold both sides." Silence followed. The weight of inevitability pressed down on every man. "You are free to leave," Leonidas continued. "Take this road south. Warn Greece. Tell them what happened here." Some protested immediately. Others bowed their heads. Leonidas raised his hand. "This is not shame. This is duty." One by one, most of the allied Greeks prepared to depart under cover night, their faces torn between relief and guilt. The Spartans did not move, nor did the Thespians. Dorio's tightened his grip on his sword. "I will not run." Alkippos nodded. "Neither will I." Leonidas looked at them, pride flickering briefly in his eyes. "Then we will hold the pass one last time." The night deepened. Stars burned cold above the cliffs. Persian torches crept along the mountain path like a line of fireflies, inching closer. The Spartans ate their final meal slowly, deliberately. "Tomorrow," Leonidas said quietly, "we fight not to win, but to finish this." No man argued. The wind rose again, whispering through the pass, carried with it the certainty that dawn would bring the end, and something far greater than defeat. Dawn came harsh and red, the kind of sunrise that stained everything it touched. The light spilled over mountains first, catching the Persian torches still burning along the high path. They were closer now, much closer. Shadows moved among the rocks where no shadows should have been. The Spartans saw them and said nothing. Leonidas stood before his men as they made ready for what they all understood would be the final engagement. There was no rush in their movements, no desperation. Armor was secured with care. Helmets were adjusted. Shields were lifted and rested against the earth. Spears were checked one last time, their tips dull from days of killing. Some men laughed quietly. Others spoke the names of their sons under their breath. Dorio's crouched beside Alkippos, binding the older man's arm more tightly. "You'll bleed through that again," Dorio said. Alkippos shrugged. "Then I'll bleed faster." Dorio's snorted. "You always were impatient." Leonidas raised his voice, not loud, but firm enough to carry. "Men of Sparta, today we do not defend Greece. Today we define it." He let the words settle. The Persians believe victory is taking ground. They believe survival is everything. Today, we will teach them something different. He turned, placing his helmet beneath his arm, and looked down the pass where the Persian army was assembling once more. Their numbers seemed even greater than before, ranks deep, banners thick as forest growth. Archers took position. Infantry shifted nervously. Officers shouted, their voices sharp with urgency. Leonidas placed his helmet on his head. Shields. The wall formed for the last time. Spears. The points lowered. The Persian horn sounded. Long sustained. Final. They came not in waves now, but as a flood. Infantry surged forward in relentless pressure, pushing the front ranks whether they wished to advance or not. Arrows darkened the sky again, falling in screaming arcs. Shields absorbed most of it. Some found flesh. No one broke formation to cry out. The first collision shook the earth. The Spartans met them with a roar, driving forward into the mass, forcing bodies back against bodies. Spears punched through armor. Shields smashed faces and throats. The narrow pass magnified every impact, every scream. Dorio's sword arm burned. He lost track of time, of motion, of anything beyond the next strike. A Persian lunged. He parried. Another grabbed his shield. He drove his knee into man's chest and shoved him backward onto waiting spears. To his left, Alkippos went down on one knee, struck hard in the side. Before Dorio's could turn, Alkippos surged back up, snarling, and buried a spear into the attacker's belly. "I'm not finished," he growled. Leonidas fought where the press was thickest. A Persian officer recognized him, shouting something in triumph as he charged. Leonidas met him head-on. Their blades clashed. The Persian was skilled, fast, desperate. Leonidas waited, reading him, then stepped inside the man's guard and drove his sword through his ribs. The officer fell, eyes wide, realization arriving too late. The Spartans advanced again, a single step bought with blood. The ground beneath them was a carpet of bodies now, unstable and slick. Men fought standing on the dead, slipping, regaining balance, never retreating. Then a shout rose from behind. Persian horns sounded again, closer, sharper. They had arrived. Leonidas heard it and knew. The immortals were coming down the mountain path, emerging behind the Greek position, their armor dark, their numbers unbroken. The trap closed fully. "Rear!" someone shouted. Leonidas turned his head just enough to confirm it. Then he raised his sword. "Do not turn," he commanded. "We finish this here." The Spartans tightened their formation, backs no longer safe, but wills unshaken. Some Thespians moved to cover the rear, forming a smaller wall against the approaching immortals. The Persians surged from both sides now, front and back. Arrows fell from above. Spears stabbed from every direction. Alkippos took an arrow through the shoulder and laughed once, breathless and raw. That all? Another blow struck his helmet, denting it inward. He fell this time, did not rise. Dorios screamed his name and fought like a man possessed, cutting down 2 attackers before a spear punched into his thigh. He staggered, braced himself on his shield, and kept swinging. Leonidas felt the impact before he felt the pain. A spear glanced off his armor. Another pierced his leg. He stumbled, caught himself, and continued fighting, blood streaming down into his sandal. The Spartans were dying now, one by one, but they died facing the enemy, forcing the Persians to earn every step. The pass was choked completely, a mountain of bodies rising so high that men climbed over them to reach the living. A Persian noble struck Leonidas from behind, blades slipping beneath his armor. Leonidas turned, struck once, twice, then fell to one knee. The Spartans saw their king fall. A roar unlike any before tore from their throats. They surged toward him, forming a circle, shields locking outward, swords flashing inward. They fought not for ground, not for victory, but for the body of their king. Leonidas tried to rise. He could not. He looked up at Dorios, who was bleeding from a dozen wounds, barely standing. "Hold," Leonidas said. Dorios nodded, tears streaking through blood on his face. "Always." Leonidas' vision dimmed. The sounds of battle blurred into a distant roar. His last sight was his men standing, still standing against impossible odds. Then he was gone. The Persians pressed harder, furious now, desperate to end it. Spartans fell atop Spartans, yet even as they died, their bodies blocked the path, slowed the advance, bought moments with flesh and bone. By midday, only a handful still fought. By afternoon, none remained standing. When the noise finally faded, Thermopylae was silent again, save for the wind and the waves. The pass was open, but the cost lay piled so high that even the victors would never forget what it had taken to step through it. The silence after the fighting was heavier than any clash of steel. It settled over Thermopylae like a shroud, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the distant moan of wounded men who would not survive the day. The sea rolled in as it always had, indifferent, washing blood from stones only to stain them again with each wave. Persian soldiers moved cautiously into the pass, stepping over bodies with care, as if the dead might still rise and strike. Many avoided looking down. Others stared too long, faces pale beneath their helmets. They had won, yet no one spoke of victory. Xerxes arrived hours later. His chariot halted at the edge of the carnage. He dismounted slowly, his silk robes dragging through dust darkened by blood. Around him, his guard stood rigid, eyes fixed forward. "This is the place?" he asked. A commander bowed. "Yes, great king." Xerxes walked forward, his sandals slipping on wet stone. He had imagined this moment differently. He had imagined kneeling Greeks, broken spears, a clear road south. Instead, he saw mountains of corpses, Persian corpses, stacked so high they formed grotesque walls within the pass. They were only a few, Xerxes said more to himself than to anyone else. "Yes, great king," the commander replied. "Only a few." They found Leonidas beneath a heap of bodies, his armor battered, his sword still clenched in his hand. Xerxes stared at him for a long time. This was the man who had defied him with 300 warriors and a narrow road. "Cut off his head," Xerxes ordered suddenly, his voice sharp with anger. "Display it." The command startled his officers. It was against Persian custom. Even enemies of great courage were usually honored in death. But no one questioned him. As the order was carried out, a ripple of unease passed through the Persian ranks. This was not triumph. It was vengeance. The bodies of the Spartans were stripped and burned where they lay. The Thespians were given no distinction. The Thebans who had surrendered earlier were spared, though their fate would be debated long after the smoke cleared. By nightfall, the Persian army moved on, leaving Thermopylae behind. Fires died down. The pass returned slowly to the wind and the sea. Far to the south, Greek messengers ran. They carried no tales of victory. They carried something more powerful. They held. One said breathlessly as he reached Athens. They held against the whole of Persia. "How long?" another asked. "Long enough." The story spread faster than any army. In Sparta, mothers listened in silence as names were spoken. No cries rose from the city. Spartan law forbade it, but behind closed doors, grief flowed freely. In Athens, the news struck like a hammer. Fear followed, but so did resolve. The delay at Thermopylae had bought precious time. Ships were readying. Walls were being abandoned. Themistocles' plan would now live or die on the sea. Months later, at Salamis, Persian ships burned in the narrow straits, trapped just as their army had been trapped on land. And later still, at Plataea, the Persian invasion was broken for good. None of that would have happened without Thermopylae. Years passed. Empires shifted. Xerxes returned home, his ambition scarred by a narrow pass and a handful of men who refused to yield. Greece survived, fractured and imperfect, but free. Travelers who later passed through Thermopylae found a stone set into the earth. It was simple. No grand carving. No boasting. Just words. "Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their laws." The Spartans had not stopped Persia. Not alone, but they had shown the world what resistance looked like when defeat was certain and courage was chosen anyway. They did not fight for glory. They did not fight to survive. They fought so others could stand where they fell and choose their own fate. And that choice, more than any victory, echoed through history long after the blood was gone. In the weeks that followed Thermopylae, the pass itself became quiet again, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried weight. Travelers felt it before they understood it, as if the stones remembered the sound of shields and the air still held the breath of men who had chosen not to flee. Persian supply columns moved south along the road the Spartans had sealed with their bodies. Soldiers marched past the burned ground with lowered voices. Some made small offerings to unnamed gods without knowing why. Others hurried, eager to leave the place behind. Victory had been claimed, yet no song followed it. Among the Persian ranks, stories spread despite orders to silence them. Men spoke of Spartans who fought with broken spears, with swords bent useless, with bare hands. Of men who refused to kneel even when surrounded. Officers tried to dismiss the tales as exaggeration, but fear does not listen to rank. Xerxes reached Athens weeks later to find a city emptied of most of its people. The Acropolis burned, but the victory felt hollow. His advisors reminded him of Thermopylae often, always indirectly, always carefully. The Greeks were not broken. They were adapting. In Sparta, the dead were honored without ceremony. No monuments were raised in the city itself. Spartan custom demanded restraint. Yet every young boy heard the names. Every training ground echoed with them. Leonidas was spoken of not as a fallen king, but as a standard. He stood. Instructors told their students, "So must you." Elsewhere in Greece, the story grew larger. Poets added color. Rhetoricians added speeches that were never spoken. But beneath the myth, the truth remained sharp and uncomfortable. Men had chosen certain death to delay an enemy they could not defeat. That choice changed everything. When the Greek fleet faced Persia at Salamis, Many of the rowers were men who had heard the story of Thermopylae only weeks before. As Persian ships crowded into narrow straits, Greek commanders remembered the lesson written in blood on land. Narrow spaces erase numbers. Discipline breaks empires. The Persian navy burned. The sea filled with wreckage and screams, much as the past had. At Plataea, when Greek hoplites finally met the Persian army in open battle, fear was still there, but it was tempered by memory. If 300 could stand against an empire, then tens of thousands could break it. And they did. Years later, when travelers asked old soldiers where the war had truly turned, many did not name Salamis or Plataea. They named Thermopylae, not because it was a victory, because it proved something essential. That war is not only decided by outcomes, but by moments, by decisions made when success is impossible and retreat would be reasonable, by men who understand that time can be as powerful as force. The Spartans did not believe themselves immortal. They believed in obedience, to law, to duty, to each other. Leonidas did not order his men to die. He allowed them to choose, and they chose to remain. That distinction mattered. As decades passed, the landscape of Thermopylae changed. The sea receded. The pass widened. What had once been a narrow throat became an open plain. Armies could no longer be stopped there. Nature itself erased the battlefield. But memory did not fade so easily. Roman writers admired the stand, even as Rome built its own empire. Medieval scholars debated whether it was bravery or madness. Modern historians stripped away exaggeration, counted numbers more carefully, argued about tactics and logistics. Yet none could deny the core truth. Against overwhelming force, the Spartans and their allies had bought time with their lives, and time reshaped history. The cost was absolute. No Spartan returned from that final stand. No songs welcomed them home. Their families mourned quietly, bearing loss as law demanded. But Greece survived, and from that survival came ideas that outlived empires. Citizenship debate, self-rule, the belief that power could be challenged, even when challenge seemed hopeless. Thermopylae was not about killing Persians. It was about refusing to submit when submission was the easier path. That is why the story endured. Because every generation finds itself at its own narrow pass, facing forces too large to defeat outright. And in those moments, the question returns, not whether victory is possible, but whether standing still has value. At Thermopylae, men answered that question with their lives. They lost the battle. They shaped the world. Long after the ashes of Thermopylae cooled, the name of the man who betrayed the path lingered like a bad taste. Ephialtes did not receive the reward he imagined. The Persians distrusted him. Greeks despised him. He fled, hunted by whispers and promises of silver. In time, he was killed in a petty dispute far from the pass he had doomed. When news reached Sparta, there was no celebration. Justice, like duty, did not require applause. What mattered more was what followed. In the months after the war turned, envoys traveled between Greek cities with a new tone. They argued less about precedence and more about survival. Old rivalries did not vanish, but they quieted. Thermopylae had taught them that division was a luxury Greece could not afford. Athens rebuilt not with stone alone, but with confidence. Themistocles' walls rose quickly, to the frustration of Sparta, which feared Athenian power as much as Persian return. Yet even in disagreement, the memory of the past restrained them. Arguments ended where betrayal might have begun. Spartan mothers raised sons who asked about Leonidas not as a king, but as a man. They were told of his calm voice, his refusal to beg, his insistence that choice mattered. Boys trained harder, not chasing death, but learning how to meet it if required. Veterans of Plataea spoke of a strange moment during the battle's darkest hour. When the Persian cavalry pressed and fear crept in, someone shouted, "Remember the pass." The line held, not because of orders, but because of memory. Years later, a small delegation returned to Thermopylae. The land had already begun to change. Silt carried by rivers widened the ground. What had once been a knife's edge was now broader, gentler, almost ordinary. Only the mountains remained unchanged, watching in the same stern silence. They placed a stone there, simple and unadorned, No names, no lists, no boasts, just words meant for strangers. Travelers read them and paused, unsure why such simplicity carried such weight. Some left offerings. Others left questions. A few felt something tighten in their chest and moved on without speaking. The Persians, too, remembered. Their chronicles spoke cautiously of a narrow place where the army stalled, where the great king learned that numbers did not guarantee obedience. Xerxes' successors avoided narrow ground when they could. Generals who had marched through Thermopylae carried the lesson into other wars. Time blurred details. Numbers shifted in retelling. Speeches grew longer. Armor grew heavier in imagination. Yet even as myth wrapped itself around the event, the core remained unchanged. A stand was made. It was known it would fail. And it was made anyway. Historians would later argue about effectiveness. Could the Persians have been delayed elsewhere? Did the stand truly matter strategically or only symbolically? The debates filled pages and centuries. But soldiers understood something scholars often did not. Morale is a weapon. Thermopylae sharpened it. When later armies stood against impossible odds, Roman legions encircled, medieval defenders behind thinning walls, modern soldiers holding ground long enough for evacuation, they invoked the same idea, even if they did not know the name. Hold, delay, buy time. Courage does not require success. It requires resolve. In Sparta, old men would sometimes speak quietly the day Leonidas left, how he had looked back once at the city gates, how he had smiled, not sadly, but with certainty, as if the road ahead, though ending in death, was a correct one. No one claimed he enjoyed the choice. That was a lesson Sparta preserved most carefully. Heroism was not joy. Sacrifice was not glory. Duty was not comfort. They were obligations accepted without illusion. As generations passed, Thermopylae became less a place and more a measure. When leaders debated whether to resist or submit, someone inevitably asked, "Where's our pass?" Not to demand death, but to identify the line beyond which compromise became surrender. Some chose poorly, others chose well, but the question itself endured. Because once men had stood at Thermopylae and chosen resistance with clear eyes, no excuse of ignorance remained for those who followed. Empires rose and fell. Borders shifted. Languages changed. Yet the idea remained untouched, that even in defeat, meaning could be forged, and that sometimes the most powerful victory is the one that teaches the world how to stand when standing seems useless. At Thermopylae, that lesson was written not in ink or marble, but in blood, and it never fully faded. As centuries passed, Thermopylae drifted further from living memory and deeper into the realm of example. The men who had fought there became figures invoked in moments of crisis, their stories summoned when choice narrowed and pressure mounted. Yet the truth of what happened did not belong only to poets or generals. It lived quietly in the way societies understood sacrifice. In Sparta itself, the city that had sent Leonidas and the 300 did not survive unchanged. Time softened its severity. Its dominance waned. Eventually, Sparta became a name more than a power. But long after walls lost importance, its law endured in memory. The idea that citizenship demanded obligation, not entitlement. Young Spartans were taught that Thermopylae was not proof of Spartan superiority, but of Spartan accountability. Leonidas had gone because the law required him to stand where others could not. The 300 had followed because they understood that freedom, once surrendered, is rarely regained without cost. Outside Sparta, the story evolved differently. In Athens, philosophers debated whether the stand represented rational strategy or reckless honor. Some argued that no man should be asked to die when survival was possible. Others countered that survival, without meaning, was simply a longer form of defeat. Those debates shaped Greek thought profoundly. Democracy, still fragile, learned something from Thermopylae, that freedom required defenders willing to lose everything so others could argue, vote, and disagree in peace. When Rome rose, its generals studied Greek history carefully. Roman officers admired discipline above all else, and in the Spartans they saw discipline stripped to its purest form. Roman writers spoke of Thermopylae as a warning and an inspiration, proof that professional soldiers, properly trained and united, could hold even against overwhelming odds. Yet Rome, 2. Learn the darker lesson. Not every Thermopylae was necessary. Not every last stand was wise. The line between courage and stubbornness could be thin, and empires that mistook one for the other often paid dearly. In later centuries, as warfare changed, Thermopylae remained relevant precisely because it was not tied to technology. Spears gave way to swords, swords to muskets, muskets to machines. But the underlying truth endured. Terrain matters, unity matters, and morale can outweigh numbers, if only briefly. More importantly, Thermopylae offered a language for sacrifice. When communities faced threats they could not immediately defeat, they spoke of holding ground, buying time, standing firm. The words carried weight because history had proven they were not empty. In quieter moments, scholars returned to the human dimension. They asked what it meant to know, with certainty, that one would not return home. They examined the letters that might have been written, the sons who would grow without fathers, the wives who would receive no bodies to bury. They found no evidence of despair, not because despair was absent, but because it was mastered. That mastery was a true Spartan legacy. The men at Thermopylae were not fearless. They were disciplined enough to act despite fear. They did not march blindly into death. They assessed the situation, understood the consequences, and remained anyway. That distinction separated myth from reality. The modern world, with its distance from hand-to-hand combat, sometimes romanticized a stand too easily. It carved statues and quoted phrases without fully absorbing the cost. Yet, whenever history forced reality back into focus, during sieges, occupations, or moments when retreat meant annihilation, Thermopylae returned as a sober reminder, not a celebration. It reminded leaders that asking men to die carried moral weight. It reminded soldiers that obedience was not mindlessness. It reminded citizens that freedom was not free. Perhaps most importantly, it reminded survivors that living after sacrifice carried responsibility. The Greeks who lived beyond Thermopylae did not inherit victory as a gift. They inherited obligation. To justify the deaths, they had to resist harder, govern better, and remember honestly. When they failed, the story lost its purity. When they succeeded, Thermopylae gained meaning beyond bloodshed. Today, the battlefield itself looks unremarkable. Roads pass through. Cars travel where shields once locked. Tourists take photographs, often unaware of how narrow the ground once was, how impossible the odds have felt. But those who know the history feel it, not as pride, not as triumph, but as gravity. Thermopylae endures not because it was unique, but because it was clear. Clear in purpose, clear in consequence, clear in choice. The Spartans did not mistake death for victory. They understood that sometimes the role history assigns is not to win, but to hold, long enough for others to act. That understanding has outlived kings, empires, and weapons, and it remains one of the most uncomfortable, enduring truths war has ever taught humanity. The years after Thermopylae revealed a strange paradox. The battle was lost, yet effects resonated across Greece as though it had been a victory. The road south was open, yes, and the Persian army advanced. Yet time had been bought, precious and costly, and the Greek city-states were preparing in ways they could not have if the pass had fallen without resistance. In Athens, Themistocles paced atop the newly built walls, listening to the roar of the sea against the coastline. Ships were being readied. Rowers drilled in the shallow waters, and soldiers manned the fortifications with grim efficiency. He had received news from those few Greek survivors who had fled Thermopylae under Leonidas' orders. They held, one messenger said, 300 and the others with them. They held until the end. Themistocles' lips pressed thin. Then we have time, he muttered, almost to himself. Time is a weapon. Meanwhile, the Persian forces, their arrogance shaken by the Spartan resistance, advanced slowly, cautiously. They had underestimated the value of courage in a narrow pass. Thousands of soldiers who had expected an easy march south now had to contend with delayed supplies, exhausted troops, and the nagging knowledge that even the smallest Greek cities could fight with discipline beyond expectation. Thermopylae itself became a place of whispered awe among survivors. Those who had returned told stories of the Spartan formation, of bronze shields locking together like walls of stone, of spears striking with terrifying precision. They spoke of Leonidas' calm, his voice cutting to the chaos, his eyes unyielding even as death approached. The Spartan legacy was living proof that discipline, preparation, and unity could hold even when hope seemed futile. But the human cost was never forgotten. Mothers in Sparta would whisper the names of the fallen to their sons. Fathers would remind them that honor had a price. And young boys trained tirelessly, learning that courage was measured in deeds, not words. At sea, the Greek navy took advantage of the time Thermopylae had bought. Narrow straits near Salamis were chosen deliberately, echoing the lesson of the past. Terrain could multiply strength. Persian ships crowded into the channel, their numbers irrelevant in a space too small to maneuver effectively. Greek triremes struck with deadly efficiency, ramming and cutting, as their disciplined crews followed each command without hesitation. The Persians panicked, their formations breaking. Fires flared which splintered, and the sea swallowed hundreds of ships. Back on land, the few Greek survivors who had escaped Thermopylae carried the story forward. They were not celebrated. They were duty-bound. Yet their account of what had occurred inspired generals, soldiers, and citizens alike. Across Greece, the idea spread that resistance was possible, that numbers alone did not guarantee success, and that courage could turn the tide even when the outcome seemed predetermined. Xerxes, observing from a distance, felt the sting of humiliation despite his army's victories on land. His plans for Greece were delayed, disrupted, and ultimately thwarted by a handful of men who chose to face annihilation rather than surrender. The Persian king realized, perhaps too late, that the human spirit was as dangerous a weapon as any army. In Sparta, the aftermath was quieter, more somber. The dead were honored privately. Monuments were few, but memory was meticulous. Every boy and every soldier knew the names of the fallen, and the story was woven into daily life, into training, into law, into every lesson of discipline and duty. Thermopylae was less about glory than about an obligation fulfilled. It became a measure of what it meant to be Spartan. Courage accepted with clarity, fear managed, and sacrifice embraced without illusion. Centuries later, historians and poets would interpret Thermopylae differently. Some exaggerated numbers. Others romanticized acts of bravery. But the essence was simple. Men chose to resist, knowing they would die. They held the past to protect others, to delay an unstoppable force, to teach a lesson that would outlive them. This clarity shaped military thinking for generations. Commanders studied the terrain. Officers trained their men in tight formations. Soldiers were reminded that the value of resistance was not always an immediate victory, but in the consequences that followed. Even beyond the battlefield, Thermopylae left a mark. Philosophers debated the ethics of sacrifice. Leaders weighed duty against self-preservation. Citizens reflected on the meaning of freedom when those who protected it could not return home. Every age found a lesson in the stand. That courage was defined not by the odds of winning, but by the choice to act despite them. The narrow pass, long since widened by time and erosion, became a symbol rather than a battlefield. Tourists walked the stones, unaware of the weight beneath their feet. Archaeologists pieced together armor fragments and spearheads. Scholars reconstructed formations and strategies. But none could replicate the decision made by Leonidas and his men, to stand unyielding against overwhelming force. Thermopylae endured because it asked questions every generation must face. When is it right to resist? When is sacrifice necessary? And how do you act when defeat is inevitable? Leonidas' name persisted, but so did the collective memory of the 300 Spartans, the Thespians, and all who had stood alongside them. They were remembered not for winning, but for defining courage, shaping history with their final choices. And though time would claim kingdoms, cities, and empires, Thermopylae remained as it had always been, a testament to the idea that even in certain death, men could teach the world how to stand. The wind continued to sweep through the pass. The sea continued to lap at the rocks. And somewhere in the memory of all who knew the story, the voices of the fallen still echoed, calm, disciplined, and unwavering, a reminder that freedom demands courage and that the cost of liberty is always real. The landscape of Thermopylae slowly transformed over the centuries, yet the memory of that narrow pass remained sharper than the stones themselves. Nature reclaimed the battlefield, washing away blood and shifting soil, yet the lessons etched into the land and hearts of men could not be erased. The cliffs rose silently, as they had for millennia, watching over a place where courage had been measured in breaths and seconds, not in victories or spoils. In Sparta, the story of Leonidas and his 300 men became central to the education of every boy who took up a spear. Fathers recounted the stand with precision, emphasizing order, discipline, and choice. They did not embellish glory, nor did they soften the cost. Young Spartans were told that to die for a purpose was noble only when the purpose was understood and chosen freely. Fear was real and grief inevitable, but so was resolve. Elsewhere in Greece, Thermopylae took on the dual role of warning and inspiration. Politicians cited the courage of few to argue for unity among the city-states. Military instructors taught formations that mirrored the Spartans' phalanx, showing how coordination and discipline could resist far larger forces. Strategists studied the pass as an object lesson. The terrain could amplify determination, just as easily as it could trap the unprepared. For the Persians, Thermopylae became an uncomfortable memory buried among their records of conquest. Xerxes returned home, victorious on paper but troubled in spirit. The soldiers who had fought the Spartans carried scars of both flesh and pride. Many of them had expected an easy march south, yet they confronted something that defied calculation, a small, united force that leveraged skill, terrain, and willpower against impossible odds. The lesson was etched into Persian strategy. Strength alone was not sufficient without respect for the courage of an enemy. In the months following the battle, Greek forces consolidated along key coastal cities. The naval engagement at Salamis relied heavily on the delay afforded by Thermopylae. Greek triremes, fewer in number but expertly coordinated, struck Persian ships as they crowded the straits, just as Spartans had funneled the enemy into a narrow pass. The victory at sea was not the result of raw power, but of preparation and understanding, a principle first dramatized in the mountain pass. Survivors who had fled Thermopylae spread word of the Spartans' valor, and the stories evolved into a collective memory that inspired countless others. Soldiers who had never seen the pass found courage in the idea of those who had. Citizens learned that freedom came at a price, and that some sacrifices were greater than life itself. The narrative of Thermopylae extended beyond battlefield tactics. It became a template for moral courage and civic responsibility. Generations later, historians would examine the numbers, the weapons, the logistics, and debate what might have happened if the Persians had chosen different paths, or if more Greeks had been present. Scholars weighed the strategic delay against the ultimate loss of life and territory. They questioned whether the stand was necessary from a purely military perspective. Yet these arguments never diminished the emotional and symbolic weight of Thermopylae. Its value lay not in its outcome, but in its demonstration of human choice under extreme pressure. The Spartans themselves, though all fallen in the final engagement, remained present in memory through their laws and traditions. Every boy who grew to manhood in the city understood that courage required awareness, that discipline was a responsibility, and that true strength demanded sacrifice without expectation of reward. Thermopylae became a lesson in duty, an enduring standard against which subsequent generations measured themselves. As the centuries passed, the battlefield drew travelers from far and wide. Scholars, soldiers, and pilgrims came to see the place where human resolve had resisted the tide of an empire. They walked carefully among stones that had once been trodden by warriors' boots, noting the narrowness of the pass and imagining the tension of shields locked together, spears flashing, and men dying not out of recklessness but out of deliberate choice. Even as maps were redrawn and empires rose and fell, Thermopylae retained its symbolic power. Leaders invoked its lesson in moments of crisis, teaching that preparation, unity, and courage could offset overwhelming numbers. Philosophers used it to examine the ethics of sacrifice and the responsibilities of those in power. Ordinary citizens drew inspiration from the story when facing challenges that demanded persistence, courage, and resilience. The narrow pass itself eventually changed. Geological shifts, erosion, and human construction widened the land, erasing the exact contours that had defined the battlefield. But memory preserved the geometry of courage. Every account, every retelling, Every lesson passed from one generation to the next recreated the lines, the formations, and the pressure being trapped yet unyielding. Thermopylae became more than a location. It became a standard for evaluating courage. When men and women faced circumstances in which failure seemed inevitable, they asked themselves whether they could stand as the Spartans did. Could they resist? Could they, by time, preserve ideals and influence the course of events even in the shadow of death? In this way, Thermopylae survived as a moral and strategic compass, teaching that even the smallest number, acting with clarity, discipline, and conviction, could alter the flow of history. The Spartans' decision to hold the pass transcended military calculations. It was a choice that echoed through time, reminding every observer that courage and sacrifice carry a weight far beyond immediate results. By all measures, the Spartans lost a battle. Their bodies littered the pass. Their blood mingled with the earth and sea. Yet they had won in a far deeper sense. They had defined what it meant to resist, to act decisively in the face of impossible odds, and to make a deliberate choice knowing that the cost was life itself. Centuries later, historians, soldiers, and ordinary people would continue to return to that lesson. Thermopylae was no longer just a battlefield. It was a mirror. It reflected the potential within any individual or community to act with courage, discipline, and resolve when circumstances seemed impossible. It became a story of the human spirit, of the price of freedom, and of the enduring value of deliberate, principled choice. And in every retelling, the same truth remained. Even in loss, meaning could be found. Even in defeat, the actions of a few could shape the destiny of many. Thermopylae endured not as a monument to death, but as a testament to the power of resolve, the weight of duty, and the timeless lesson that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Long after the dust settled and the waves lapped quietly against the stones of Thermopylae, the true measure of the battle became not the ground won or lost, but the human will it revealed. Scholars and storytellers alike would describe the narrow pass, the clash of shields, the flash of bronze, yet those were only the surface. Beneath it lay the essence of choice, the moment when men decided, fully aware of what awaited them, that some principles were worth dying for. In Sparta, the impact of Thermopylae persisted in daily life. The mothers who had lost sons spoke little, but their silence carried weight. The fathers who had trained boys in spear and shield ensured that every step, every movement, every decision was tied to discipline and duty. Boys learned not only to fight, but to bear the consequences of decisions, understanding that freedom and responsibility were inseparable. Each act of courage was measured, examined, and passed down as lore rather than legend. The Thespians who stayed alongside the Spartans, refusing the chance to flee, became part of this broader narrative of shared sacrifice. Their deaths were less recorded, less celebrated, yet they were remembered by those who returned to tell the story. Greece, as a whole, came to understand that Thermopylae was not just Spartan valor. It was a unified stand against overwhelming force. And the idea spread. Even a few could influence many. Even a narrow path could shape history. Meanwhile, the Persian Empire continued its campaigns across Greece, but the delay at Thermopylae had done its work. By the time the Persian army approached key city-states, Greek forces had fortified walls, prepared fleets, and organized defensive strategies. The psychological impact of knowing a small group could resist so effectively influenced commanders and soldiers alike. Fear, respect, and caution now accompanied the once confident advance. The stand at Thermopylae also became a moral touchstone for leaders across the Mediterranean world. Roman generals, centuries later, studied the pass and the phalanx formations, admiring not just the discipline but the clarity of purpose. Philosophers cited it when discussing ethics and duty. Civic leaders used it as an example of the weight of responsibility when lives and liberty were at stake. The story traveled far beyond the battlefield, influencing thought, strategy, and culture long after the swords had cooled. Historians would debate numbers and tactics endlessly. Did the Spartans truly make a difference in the Persian campaign? Could a different strategy have prolonged resistance further? Scholars would reconstruct the timeline, measure distances, analyze supply lines, and speculate on what might have been. Yet no calculation could capture the immovable resolve of men who understood death and chose defiance anyway. That was the essence of Thermopylae, the triumph of choice over inevitability. Every soldier who survived Plataea or Salamis carried in their mind the memory of Thermopylae. It was a benchmark of endurance and courage. When armies face impossible odds, commanders would whisper the lesson. Discipline and unity can outweigh sheer numbers, if only for a critical moment. It was a standard that tested not only tactics but morality. Could one hold the line when hope was gone, knowing that delay could save thousands? Thermopylae answered that question definitively. The physical landscape, of course, changed. Centuries of erosion and human construction widened the pass. What had been a strategic choke point became accessible by ordinary travel. But the memory of its narrowness remained in stories, maps, and collective imagination. Travelers sensed the gravity of the place, even when the terrain no longer demanded respect. Scholars reconstructed formations on paper. Armies practiced drills inspired by the phalanx. In every retelling, the essence remained: courage, discipline, and deliberate choice could challenge the impossible. Thermopylae's influence extended even to the philosophical understanding of war. The battle posed questions about duty, sacrifice, and leadership that endured far beyond the battlefield. When citizens or soldiers were asked to risk themselves for the greater good, the story of Leonidas and the 300 provided context. It reminded them that strategic delay, moral clarity, and disciplined resistance could outlive the individual, shaping the course of events long after death. For the Spartans, Thermopylae was a lens through which every subsequent action was measured. Their identity became inseparable from the idea of standing in the face of overwhelming odds. Courage was not defined as reckless bravery, but as a deliberate, conscious decision to uphold principle despite mortal danger. The memory of the fallen formed the ethical backbone of Spartan society. Even as empires rose and fell, the story survived. Roman, Byzantine, and later historians drew upon the narrative to illustrate discipline and heroism. Military academies around the world, in centuries yet to come, would continue to cite Thermopylae as a case study. How narrow terrain amplifies strategic advantage, how cohesion and morale can counter numerical superiority, and how leadership under impossible circumstances shapes the outcome of history. But beyond military application, Thermopylae endured as a human story. It was about fear confronted and mastered, about choice made under clarity, and about understanding the weight of one's actions. Each fallen Spartan, each Thespian who remained, demonstrated that courage was inseparable from responsibility. The legacy was not a record of conquest, but a testament to the human capacity for resolve. Today, as visitors walk the pass, the landscape appears deceptively calm. The wind drifts through the rocks. The sea laps at the shore. Yet beneath the ordinary surface lies a memory that refuses to fade, a record of men who chose to stand when every calculation predicted their end. That choice, made in bronze and blood, has echoed for millennia, teaching each generation anew that the measure of courage is not in survival, but in fidelity to principle when the outcome is certain. Thermopylae endures not as a battlefield of victory, but as a crucible of the human spirit. And in that enduring truth, the story of Leonidas and his men continues to shape the way humanity understands courage, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom. The memory of Thermopylae grew stronger as centuries passed, not because of victory, but because of choice. Scholars, soldiers, and ordinary citizens alike returned to the story to understand the meaning of courage in the face of certainty. The narrow pass, once a simple strip of land between cliffs and sea, had become a symbol of what disciplined resolve could achieve. It reminded all who heard the tale that even when the outcome is known, the act of resistance carries power beyond immediate results. In Sparta, the story was taught in quiet rigor. Boys learned not to seek glory, but to respect duty. Mothers spoke of the fallen with measured reverence. Fathers emphasized discipline and obedience, and every citizen understood that liberty demanded sacrifice. Young men trained tirelessly, not simply to wield spear and shield, but to internalize the idea that courage is tested most when survival is impossible. Fear was acknowledged, but it was never allowed to dictate action. Across Greece, the tale of Thermopylae influenced strategy and thought alike. Military leaders studied formations, terrain, and timing. The narrow pass became a case study in how a small, disciplined force could delay a far larger army. Tacticians argued over the minutiae. How many men could hold a phalanx? How long a rear guard could slow pursuit? what the psychological effect of such resistance might be on both enemy and ally. Yet beyond the numbers, all agreed on one principle. Morale and unity could shape history as decisively as weapons. The Persian Empire, though vast, could not erase the lessons of Thermopylae. Xerxes returned home with a mix of triumph and unease. His army had won the pass, yet the resistance of few had delayed his advance and bought precious time for Greek cities to prepare defenses. Generals who served him recorded the battle carefully, noting how courage could disrupt even overwhelming strength. Even in defeat, the Spartans had won a kind of immortality. As decades passed, Thermopylae became a moral touchstone, a benchmark for human conduct in the face of adversity. Philosophers debated the ethics of sacrifice. Citizens pondered the responsibility to act when confronted with danger. Leaders questioned how to weigh the cost of lives against the strategic value of resistance. Each retelling reinforced the same truth. Choice mattered. Courage was not absence of fear. It was deliberate action in spite of it. During later conflicts, armies invoked Thermopylae as a standard. Roman soldiers studied the phalanx and the terrain to understand discipline under pressure. Medieval knights examined it to consider the value of defense in choke points. Even in modern warfare, generals recognized that carefully chosen terrain, disciplined troops, and moral clarity could delay far larger forces and influence outcomes beyond the immediate battlefield. The physical pass itself changed over time. Natural erosion widened the space, rivers shifted course, and human roads cut through the mountains. Yet the moral geography remained intact. Each visitor sensed the gravity beneath the stones, the tension in the air that had once been defined by shields, spears, and screams. Scholars reconstructed the formations on paper, and soldiers drilled similar maneuvers. But no simulation could fully convey the weight of deliberate sacrifice. Thermopylae endured because it posed a question for all who came after. What would you do when survival is impossible, yet resistance matters? The answer was never easy, and it was never comfortable. To stand, knowing death was certain, required clarity of purpose, discipline, and commitment to something larger than oneself. That was a lesson Leonidas imparted, not in speeches or proclamations, but in every ordered step of the phalanx and every locked shield of the 300. The story of the Spartans and their allies became intertwined with the identity of Greece itself. Athens, Sparta, and other city-states drew lessons in unity, strategy, and moral courage. Citizens learned that freedom demanded defenders willing to act decisively, even at cost. Leaders learned that inspiration could be as powerful a weapon as swords. And soldiers learned that discipline and collective action could delay forces far stronger, creating opportunities for decisive victories elsewhere. Through centuries of reinterpretation, Thermopylae's essence remained unchanged. The men who fought there were not mythic heroes in bronze. They were disciplined humans, aware of mortality, yet committed to principle. They understood that survival was not the measure of courage. Faithfulness to duty was. Every shield struck, every spear thrust, every step forward under arrows and enemy blades demonstrated a choice that transcended fear. Even as empires rose and fell, the lesson persisted. Thermopylae was less a place than a measure, a test of resolve, a standard of conduct. Leaders invoked it to inspire action. Soldiers remembered to steel themselves, and philosophers examined it to understand human ethics under pressure. Its endurance was testament to universal truth. Courage is defined not by numbers or victory, but by the conscious choice to act when all else is lost. Modern historians would piece together the battlefield, estimating numbers, reconstructing timelines, and analyzing tactics. Yet they could never fully capture the human dimension, the fear, the discipline, the unflinching resolve. That dimension was invisible to calculations, yet visible in every subsequent generation that recognized Thermopylae as a lesson in deliberate resistance. The Spartans had lost the battle. Their bodies were claimed by the pass, their swords and shields silent on the stones. Yet in that loss, they achieved something far greater. They had delayed an empire, inspired allies, and created a moral standard that would outlast kings, armies, and nations. Their actions reverberated through history, a reminder that courage, discipline, and principle are forces capable of shaping the course of events, even against impossible odds. Thermopylae became a mirror for humanity, a measure of choice under pressure, a reflection of duty in the shadow of death. Those who study today, whether as soldiers, scholars, or ordinary citizens, confront the same question that Leonidas' men faced. When survival is impossible and the odds are overwhelming, what will you do? And that is why Thermopylae endures, not as a simple battlefield, not as a tale of victory or defeat, but as a testament to the enduring power of human resolve, sacrifice, and the unwavering commitment to principle in the face of certain death. The shadow of Thermopylae stretched far beyond its narrow pass, reaching into centuries yet to come. Every time an army faced impossible odds, every time a city confronted an overwhelming threat, the story of Leonidas and his 300 returned, not as legend, but as a reminder of the choices that define history. Courage is not measured in victory alone. It is measured in resolve, in discipline, in the willingness to act when every calculation predicts failure. In Sparta, the memory was more than history. It was law. Boys trained with spears and shields not only to master technique, but to understand principle. Each drill carried an echo of the past. Hold the line, trust your neighbor, and act with clarity of purpose. Mothers and fathers reminded their children of the cost. To live without courage, they said, is to surrender before the fight begins. And every Spartan boy, as he grew, carried that lesson in every step and every breath. The Thespians, whose sacrifice had been nearly as complete as the Spartans, remained a quieter note in the story. Their families told the tale in hushed tones, teaching that honor does not require fame, and that duty is often measured in sheer resolve rather than recognition. Greece as a whole learned that a small, determined force, united in purpose, could delay empires, influence outcomes, and shape the moral landscape far beyond the battlefield. The Persian Empire, vast and mighty, had underestimated that moral landscape. Xerxes returned home, his victory hollow in its triumph. The army had taken the pass, yes, but the delay allowed Greek cities to prepare defenses, fortify walls, and organize fleets. The psychological impact of Thermopylae haunted Persian commanders as much as any battlefield defeat. Courage, disciplined and determined, had disrupted the trajectory of conquest. At sea, the effect of the Spartan stand was clear. The Greek navy, trained and ready, used narrow straits as salamis to devastating effect. Fewer ships, better positioned, coordinated with precision. The Persian fleet, crowded and overconfident, floundered under the concentrated assault. The narrow pass had been a rehearsal, a lesson in terrain and coordination, a moral and tactical template that the Greeks applied to greater effect. Over time, the story of Thermopylae evolved in meaning. Scholars debated tactics, historians counted forces, and generals studied formations. But beyond logistics and strategy, the essence remained: deliberate resistance, informed by discipline and courage, can influence outcomes beyond the immediacy of combat. Numbers alone do not guarantee success. Morale, training, and principle can shift the balance even when the odds are impossible. The Spartans themselves did not survive to see the wider consequences. Their law and society memorialized their sacrifice, ensuring that the principle of Thermopylae outlived its participants. Their discipline became the measure against which all subsequent generations evaluated courage. It was not recklessness. It was deliberate, conscious choice under clarity of purpose. That distinction mattered. In cities across Greece, Thermopylae became a moral standard. Citizens learned that freedom required defenders willing to risk everything. Leaders learned that inspiration could amplify strategy. Armies learned that unity could compensate for disparity in numbers. And individuals learned that courage, in its purest form, required understanding both fear and consequence, and acting anyway. The narrow pass eventually widened through erosion, and human construction further altered its geography. Yet the memory of that constrained battlefield remained vivid in literature, philosophy, and military study. Each retelling recreated the tension, the pressing weight of bodies, the locked shields, the measured breaths, and the conscious choice to stand. Geography changed, but moral geography endured. Historians and strategists would reconstruct the battle endlessly, arguing over dates, numbers, and tactical details. Yet the true lesson transcended facts. Thermopylae was not about who died first, or who fell in what order. It was about what could be achieved when clarity of purpose meets disciplined courage, when principle outweighs fear, and when the individual acts in service of a collective moral standard. Every army that faced impossible odds afterward carried the echo of Thermopylae. Roman legions studied it as an example of discipline under pressure. Medieval defenders learned the value of choke points. Modern generals drew lessons in strategy and morale. And across all eras, the human element remained the same. Courage is not measured by survival, but by the willingness to act decisively in the face of inevitability. Thermopylae endured because it asked questions that every generation must answer. When survival is unlikely and the odds are overwhelming, what will you do? Will you flee, surrender, or stand? The Spartans, the Thespians, and their allies made their choice clear. They acted with deliberation, discipline, and unwavering commitment, demonstrating that principle can shape outcomes far beyond immediate calculation. The battlefield, though transformed by centuries, continued to carry the weight of memory. The wind across the pass, the sound of the sea against the cliffs, the narrow confines between mountains and water, all reminded visitors of what had transpired. It was not just a place of death. It was a crucible of human resolve, a testament to the power of choice, and a measure of the moral and physical courage that defines history. Thermopylae survived not as a monument of victory, but as a lesson in the human spirit. Every generation that studied it confronted the same fundamental truth. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Sacrifice has value when purpose is understood. Discipline matters as much as strength. Unity and trust can multiply the effect of even the smallest force. And sometimes, the most profound victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the enduring influence of principled action. Through millennia, Thermopylae reminded humanity that even in loss, meaning can be found. The Spartans fell, but their decisions shaped history. The past became a mirror for all who face impossible odds, a reflection of what it means to hold firm, to act deliberately, and leave a legacy that outlives the individual. And so, the story of Thermopylae remains, a testament to courage, sacrifice, discipline, and the enduring truth that in the shadow of certain death, the choice to stand defines a measure of a human being. The centuries that followed Thermopylae were unkind to empires, but kind to memory. Sparta, once a dominant power, waned. Athens rose and fell. Persia receded into history. Yet the narrow pass remained, not as a battlefield, but as a symbol, etched into the conscience of civilizations. Every generation found in it a mirror reflecting the timeless question, when faced with impossible odds, what will you do? Travelers walked the stones centuries later, often unaware of their weight. The cliffs and sea appeared ordinary, yet beneath the surface lingered a memory of men who had chosen defiance over surrender. Scholars reconstructed the formations, military historians measured the width of the pass, and writers spun the story into prose and poetry. But no measurement or narrative could fully capture the tension, the fear, the clarity of purpose, or the quiet dignity of those who stood their ground. In Sparta, the lesson endured in law and practice. Boys trained with shields not only to master the art of combat, but to internalize the discipline that Thermopylae demanded. Mothers spoke quietly of sacrifice, fathers emphasized duty, and teachers reminded students that liberty had a cost. Young men grew with the understanding that courage was not recklessness, that action must be deliberate, and that fear was a companion, not a barrier. Elsewhere, the story became a touchstone for leaders, soldiers, and citizens alike. Roman generals studied it to understand discipline and terrain. Medieval defenders considered it when holding castles and passes. Modern strategists would eventually cite it when analyzing choke points, force multiplication, and morale. The physical battle was long over, but the strategic and moral lessons endured, proving that human resolve could influence outcomes even against overwhelming force. The Persian Empire never forgot. Xerxes returned home, victorious but uneasy. The delay at Thermopylae had altered his plans, allowing Greek cities time to prepare defenses. What was supposed to be a swift conquest became a drawn-out campaign, culminating in the Greek naval victory at Salamis and the decisive battles on land at Plataea. The courage of a few had shifted the trajectory of history, demonstrating that moral and psychological factors could outweigh numerical superiority. Thermopylae's influence extended far beyond warfare. Philosophers debated the ethics of sacrifice and the responsibilities of leadership. Citizens considered the cost of freedom and the obligations it demanded. Each retelling reinforced the central truth: choice matters. Courage is defined not by the absence of fear, but by deliberate action in the face of it. Sacrifice carries meaning when grounded in principle, and discipline amplifies the impact of even the smallest force. The battlefield itself changed. Erosion widened the pass, rivers shifted, and roads cut through the mountains. Yet the moral geography, the sense of pressure, unity, and consequence, remained intact. Every visitor sensed it, whether consciously or not. The story had transformed from physical combat into enduring human lesson, a guidepost for how to act when the stakes are absolute and survival is uncertain. Even the lost voices of the fallen contributed to the memory. The Spartans and Thespians who died at Thermopylae left no record of their own, yet their actions spoke louder than words. They had chosen a narrow path, knowing that every breath could be their last, that every step might be their final one. And in doing so, they created a moral standard that would guide countless generations. The principle endured. A disciplined, united force can resist overwhelming numbers. A clear understanding of purpose gives weight to action. Moral clarity amplifies courage. Every soldier who studied Thermopylae understood that survival is not the measure of bravery. Every citizen who heard the tale recognized that liberty demands defenders willing to act decisively, even at the cost of life. Every leader who reflected on the past confronted the weight of responsibility. When asking others to risk everything, clarity, principle, and preparation are paramount. Over time, Thermopylae became a lens through which human courage and sacrifice were understood. Leaders invoked it to inspire action. Soldiers internalized it to strengthen resolve. And society studied it to teach ethics and strategy. The story endured not because of mythic exaggeration, but because of its absolute clarity. These men stood when most were fled, acted when all reason suggested retreat, and chose principle over survival. The lesson spread beyond Greece, across Europe and into the modern world. Thermopylae was cited as a benchmark of courage under pressure. Generals used it to teach discipline. Officers used it to cultivate morale, and citizens used it as a moral standard for decision-making in crisis. Its influence transcended military history. It became a guide for understanding the human capacity for resolve and principled action. Centuries later, as historians, philosophers, and strategists examined Thermopylae, they found a lesson that was simple but profound. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Sacrifice has meaning when guided by principle. Unity, discipline, and clarity of purpose can shape events far beyond immediate perception. Even in loss, one can achieve a form of immortality through action that teaches the world what is possible. Thermopylae had been a narrow pass, a fleeting moment in the history of empires, yet its legacy endured far beyond the men who fought there. They did not survive to see the ultimate consequences of their stand, but history remembers them not as casualties, but as architects of enduring moral and strategic lessons. Theirs was a victory not of land or numbers, but of principle, courage, and choice. Today, the pass is quiet. The wind sweeps to the mountains, the sea laps against the shore, and tourists walk the paths where shields once locked together and spears flashed under arrows. Yet beneath the ordinary landscape lies a memory of human resolve that refuses to fade. Thermopylae is not a battlefield of triumph or defeat. It is a crucible of the human spirit, a measure of courage, a testament to the cost of freedom, and a reminder that even in the shadow of certain death, deliberate action shapes history. The Spartans and their allies fell, but in doing so, they defined the essence of bravery. Their stand taught the world that courage, discipline, and sacrifice are forces that outlive empires, that the weight of choice matters more than immediate survival, that the principles for which one stands can echo across millennia, shaping not only battles but moral understanding. And so Thermopylae endures, a story of men who faced annihilation and chose defiance, of courage measured not by victory but by fidelity to duty, of sacrifice whose influence transcends time. It reminds every generation that freedom demands defenders, that principles require action, and that even in loss, meaning endures. The last echoes of shields striking, the last breaths of men who held their ground, the last moments of deliberate choice, though long gone, still speak to the world. Thermopylae is more than a battlefield. It is a standard, a mirror, a measure of the human spirit. And in that enduring legacy, the courage of Leonidas and his men remains immortal.